Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the golden hues of the setting sun bathed the Five Poppies Resort in a warm, peaceful glow, a tranquil illusion that Jocelyn couldn't bring herself to trust. While the world outside seemed to slow down, the pulse of unease within her quickened. She had been in enough high-stakes situations to recognize the warning signs, and she could feel something brewing beneath the surface of their perfectly staged getaway. Jocelyn and Vaughn had assumed the roles of a couple on vacation, nothing more than a pair of tourists enjoying the sun by the pool, exchanging flirtatious banter and superficial conversations. The air was thick with the scent of sunscreen and tropical flowers, but underneath that sweetness, Joss could sense the unmistakable tension of a covert operation. They were meant to blend in, to disappear into the crowd, but she couldn't shake the sensation that they were far from invisible. Every moment felt under surveillance, as though eyes were watching from every angle, even when there was no one there. The false sense of security was suffocating, and it gnawed at her every time she allowed herself to relax. Her instincts screamed at her to stay alert, to remain vigilant, but even so, she couldn't ignore the rare, uneasy glances Vaughn shot toward the door. Each fleeting look, each slight tension in his posture told her he was expecting something, or someone. That was the thing about missions like these, the unease wasn't always something you could articulate, but it was always there, just beneath the surface. Vaughn's behavior, his quiet anticipation, only deepened the knot in her stomach. He was waiting for something to happen, and Jocelyn couldn't help but wonder if it was something he wasn't ready for. As Vaughn excused himself to head back to the room, Jocelyn lingered outside. She stood amidst the vibrant bloom of bougainvillea, her eyes scanning the surroundings, her thoughts restless. The petals fluttered gently in the breeze, casting dappled shadows against the whitewashed walls. The resort felt like a living, breathing entity, full of bright colors and buzzing life. But the serenity around her seemed like a mask. It felt wrong. There was no room for the luxury of peace when you were in the thick of something this dangerous. The stillness in the air was deceptive. Too perfect, too calm. When Vaughn disappeared into the room, the door clicking softly behind him, Jocelyn's sharp instincts told her something was amiss. She could hear her own breath, feel her heartbeat like a drum in her ears, but everything around her was eerily silent. She stood motionless for a beat, allowing the quiet to settle over her, when suddenly, without warning, a violent thud came from inside the room. A blood-chilling gasp followed, a sound that twisted in her gut. It wasn't the noise of a simple accident, it was something far worse. The gasping, frantic breaths of someone struggling for air, desperately fighting to survive, sent a jolt of panic through her. Joss's mind went into overdrive, her training kicking in as her body moved before she had time to fully process what was happening. The voice of reason, the caution that had kept her alive in so many missions before, screamed at her to remain cautious, to call for backup, but that was all secondary to the primal need to save Vaughn. Her feet moved with purpose, her hand already reaching for the firearm holstered at her side. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the weapon, the familiar weight grounding her in a way that nothing else could. She was trained for this. This was what she was born to do. But as she reached the door, her heart dropped into her stomach. The sound of a struggle was unmistakable now. A body slamming against the floor. A muffled cry of pain. And then, the sickening sound of something tightening, something constricting. She didn't hesitate. She couldn't. She pushed the door open, just wide enough to peer into the room, and what she saw sent a chill through her entire body. Vaughn was on the floor, his face turning a violent shade of red, his eyes wide and frantic. A man, a stranger, was straddling him, his arms powerful and unyielding, forcing a thick cord around Vaughn's neck. It was a garrote, a weapon designed for quick and silent kills. Jocelyn's mind screamed, but she remained frozen for a split second, taking in the scene before she could act. Vaughn's body twitched violently as he tried to pry the cord from his throat, but his strength was waning. The attacker's face was hidden in the shadows, but his grip on Vaughn was unwavering. Time seemed to stretch, the seconds crawling by like hours as Jocelyn steadied herself. Her gun was still in her hand, and in that moment, all that mattered was the cold, clear decision to act. The hesitation was gone. She knew she had to act, to save him. She burst into the room, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the blood roaring in her ears. The gun was aimed, but her target was shifting, moving, and she couldn't risk hitting Vaughn. The attacker, sensing the threat, twisted his body with surprising agility, flinging Vaughn to the side as he turned to face Jocelyn. The violent movement sent Vaughn tumbling onto the floor, gasping for air, but the stranger, this mysterious assailant, remained calm, unruffled. He didn't rush toward her. He didn't try to escape. He simply stood there, his posture tight with the intent to fight. The gunshot rang out, sharp and deafening, cutting through the tension like a blade. The attacker staggered back, a grunt escaping his lips as he clutched his side, but he didn't fall. The bullet hadn't struck a fatal point, just enough to leave him stunned, momentarily dazed. Jocelyn rushed to Vaughn's side, her heart hammering in her chest as she checked for signs of life. His breath was ragged, but he was still alive. He had just narrowly escaped death, and the reality of what had happened crashed into her with full force. As Vaughn slowly regained his breath, his hand gripping her wrist with the faintest of squeezes, Jocelyn's mind raced. She had acted without thinking, without truly understanding the full extent of the danger they were in. But now, as she looked at the man on the floor, the man who had tried to end Vaughn's life, she realized that this attack wasn't random. The reason Vaughn had been targeted was far more complicated than she had ever anticipated. The assailant wasn't just an outsider. He was a part of something far larger, a part of a dangerous web she hadn't yet untangled. The moment the door swung open, revealing the scene before her, Jocelyn's world shattered. It was as though time itself had come to a standstill. Every muscle in her body tensed, and for a moment, she couldn't move. Vaughn, the man she had been working alongside, the man she had trusted, was fighting for his life on the floor. His body was locked in a struggle with an unknown assailant. A stranger she had never seen before, yet whose presence felt like a weight she couldn't escape. The assailant was above him, a grim expression on his face as he held Vaughn down with an almost unnatural strength. Vaughn's arms flailed weakly, his fingers desperately clawing at the cord wrapped around his neck. The electrical wire had dug deep into his skin, and Joss could see the bruising already starting to spread, his face taking on an unhealthy red hue as he gasped for breath. His eyes, wide and wild with panic, were locked in a desperate, silent plea for help. The room seemed to close in on her, the air thick with tension and the heavy, metallic taste of fear. Jocelyn's heart hammered in her chest, the thudding reverberating in her ears. Every breath felt like it was coming from someone else, her entire being consumed by the scene before her. Vaughn's body, his movements slow and weakening by the second, was a painful reminder of how fragile their lives had become in this twisted web they were entangled in. She couldn't understand how it had escalated so quickly. It all seemed too sudden, too brutal. One moment, everything was calm, too calm, and now, in the span of a few moments, everything was crumbling. Jocelyn's training kicked in with a rush, the cold, calculating survival instinct she had been conditioned to rely on in moments like these flooding her system. But the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of her focus. Fear for Vaughn, fear for herself, and fear for what this attack meant. She had to act. She had to act. Her fingers wrapped around the grip of her gun, the cold metal familiar in her palm, offering some stability. But her hands shook with the adrenaline coursing through her veins, her vision blurring momentarily with the intensity of the moment. She wasn't used to this kind of panic, wasn't used to the frantic helplessness that surged through her when someone she cared about was in immediate danger. With one quick movement, she drew the gun from her holster and stepped forward, her eyes trained on the attacker. There was no room for error. No room for hesitation. The assailant, however, seemed to be completely unfazed by the presence of the weapon. His focus was on Vaughn, on killing him, and Jocelyn's intrusion didn't even make him flinch. Vaughn's struggles grew weaker, his body lurching from side to side in a frantic attempt to break free from the suffocating pressure on his neck. His breath came in short, desperate gasps, the sound barely a whisper over the chaos of the moment. Jocelyn's stomach twisted as she watched him fight, her hand trembling as she aimed the gun at the attacker. Every move she made felt slow and deliberate, her mind screaming at her to act faster, but her body unable to respond with the swiftness she was used to. Vaughn's life hung by a thread, and it felt like the thread was slipping from her grasp with every second that passed. The attacker tightened his grip on the wire, his face now twisted in a cruel sneer, his eyes locking onto Jocelyn's with a chilling confidence. He didn't seem concerned by the gun at all. There was something cold, calculating, in the way he handled Vaughn, as if this was just another routine job, another kill to cross off the list. Jocelyn's breath hitched in her throat. She couldn't risk hitting Vaughn. Not now. Not when his life was dangling by the slimmest of threads. Focus, Joss. Focus, she mentally urged herself, her hand steadying with the reminder of her training. She had faced worse. She had survived worse. But this felt different. This felt like her fault. She should have seen this coming. She should have known. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but before she could fire, the attacker suddenly jerked his head, seemingly aware of her presence for the first time. He gritted his teeth, his hand pulling even tighter on the cord, as if he could finish the job before Jocelyn could intervene. No. Jocelyn hissed under her breath, the single word a release of all the fear and anger building inside her. Without thinking, she squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, a deafening crack in the otherwise silent room. The sound was almost too much to bear, the shockwave of it making her flinch involuntarily. The bullet struck the assailant in the shoulder, sending him stumbling back, his grip on the wire loosening just enough for Vaughn to gasp for air. The attacker hissed in pain, his hand instinctively clutching his wound. He took one look at Jocelyn, his eyes narrowing with seething hatred, before he disengaged from Vaughn entirely, taking a step back. His breathing was heavy, labored, but there was no fear in his eyes. Only cold rage. Jocelyn quickly moved to Vaughn's side, kneeling next to him. Her fingers brushed against his neck, checking for a pulse, her heart leaping when she felt the faint, but steady, rhythm of his life force. He was alive, barely, but alive. Vaughn, she whispered, the sound thick with relief. Her hand gently cupped his face, her thumb brushing against his bruised skin. Stay with me. You're going to be okay. But the attacker, no, the killer, wasn't done. He wasn't retreating. Instead, he was sizing her up, his breathing evening out as he straightened. Jocelyn's eyes widened as the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a random hit. This wasn't just some hired gun going after Vaughn. This man, this monster, was someone from her past. Someone who had been thought dead. As the dim light from the room illuminated his features, recognition flooded Jocelyn's senses, and she could hardly breathe. No. It can't be him. The man's face was unfamiliar yet not, a ghost from her past. An operative, a shadow in the intelligence community who had been erased from the WSB's files years ago. He had been linked to a mission that had gone terribly wrong, one that had seen the fall of an entire covert cell. His name had been wiped clean from records, presumed dead in an accident years ago. But here he was, standing before her, alive, and intent on finishing what had clearly been started long ago. This wasn't just a mission gone awry. This was something personal. This man, this assassin, had come back, and it was clear that Vaughn had been targeted for something far bigger than a simple hit. Jocelyn's grip on the gun tightened. She couldn't let him get away. She couldn't let him finish what he had started. Not again. With her eyes locked on his, she whispered a silent vow to herself. No one from her past was safe anymore, not him, not anyone. This was just the beginning. Jocelyn's thoughts were spinning wildly, each fragment of the past crashing into her present with brutal force. The sight of Vaughn on the floor, gasping for air, his face turning an unnatural shade of crimson as the cord tightened around his throat, was more than just a desperate struggle for survival. It was a stark reminder that they were not just up against random threats, this was personal. This was a well-organized, deeply embedded network of power, one that had been watching and waiting for this very moment. Vaughn, the man lying in front of her, had become a ticking time bomb, and Jocelyn now understood the gravity of the secret he carried. He had been the only witness to a betrayal so deep, so catastrophic, that it had shattered a covert organization from the inside out. Years ago, Vaughn had found himself standing at the center of a storm he never asked for, forced to make choices that no one should have to. He had seen people, fellow operatives, trusted allies, betray the very foundation they stood on. And that betrayal had nearly brought down an entire network of spies, informants, and double agents. The scale of it was massive. But Vaughn wasn't just a bystander. He had been the one who could expose it all. The one who had the power to take down the very people who had built their empire in the shadows. And now, here they were. The same people who had once orchestrated the downfall of so many others, the same dangerous players, were back. They hadn't disappeared into the ether. They were alive, still lurking in the shadows, and they were coming for Vaughn. The fact that they had already made an attempt on his life, sending an assassin to finish the job, confirmed it beyond any doubt. The past was catching up to them, and Jocelyn was standing right in the middle of it. As she looked at the man who had nearly killed Vaughn, something inside her clicked. This wasn't a random attack. This wasn't just some hired muscle going rogue. No, this was a message. This was a warning, a calculated move to let them know that the network was still out there, still active, still pulling the strings. Vaughn wasn't just a target, he was a symbol. He was the living, breathing proof that secrets didn't stay buried forever. His survival was a threat to everything they had worked so hard to keep hidden. Jocelyn's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. She had known for a long time that their work, their involvement in covert operations, had made them enemies. But she had never understood the depth of the danger until now. She had thought that the people who had betrayed their network, the ones who had disappeared after the fallout, were gone for good. But they hadn't been. They were still out there, still waiting for the right time to strike. And now they had. The reality of it hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She wasn't just caught up in this for professional reasons. She wasn't just fighting for Vaughn's survival. No, the truth was much darker, much more personal. She had always prided herself on being able to stay calm, to keep a level head in the face of danger. But now, as she stood there, her gun still in her hand, her eyes locked on the man who had tried to kill Vaughn, Jocelyn realized that she, too, was a target. The attacker was a part of a larger network, one that had been watching, waiting. And now, Jocelyn had crossed the line. She knew too much. She had witnessed too much. And there was no way for her to walk away from this. The same network that had tried to eliminate Vaughn was now targeting her. And they would stop at nothing to ensure she never breathed a word of what she knew. Jocelyn's heart pounded in her chest, her body still tense from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Her fingers gripped the gun tightly, but she was keenly aware of how vulnerable she was. The man who had tried to kill Vaughn had now turned his attention to her, his cold eyes narrowing as he took in her stance. He didn't seem afraid. If anything, he seemed almost amused. Like he had all the time in the world to take care of her. Her stomach churned as she realized the full scope of what was at stake. This wasn't just about surviving an attack. It wasn't just about escaping with their lives. This was about something much larger, something much more dangerous. The people behind the network that had once been dismantled weren't just trying to eliminate threats. They were trying to eliminate any possibility of exposure. They were trying to make sure that no one could ever reveal the truth about them. Jocelyn knew she was now a liability. She knew too much about what had really happened all those years ago, about the people who had pulled the strings from behind the scenes. She had seen firsthand the lengths to which this network was willing to go to protect itself. And now, it was clear that they would stop at nothing to ensure their secret stayed hidden. Her gaze never left the attacker as she processed this new reality. The man who had been trying to kill Vaughn was no longer just an assassin. He was a symbol, a reminder of how deep the rot ran. He was a part of something much larger, something that had been carefully constructed in the shadows for years. And now, Jocelyn was in the crosshairs. She was as much a threat to their secrecy as Vaughn was. For a moment, she felt a wave of fear wash over her. She had always been able to compartmentalize, to separate the mission from her emotions. But now, as the full weight of the situation hit her, she realized that there was no separating herself from the danger anymore. She was as deeply entangled in this as Vaughn was. They had both become liabilities, and there was no escaping the consequences of what they knew. As her mind raced, her eyes flickered back to Vaughn, who was still struggling to breathe, his chest heaving with the effort. His face was still contorted in pain, but there was a spark of recognition in his eyes as he met hers. It was as if he, too, understood the depth of the danger they were in. Jocelyn took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. She couldn't afford to panic. She couldn't afford to let fear take control. There was no room for hesitation. She had to act. The man standing before her was only a part of the puzzle. There were others out there, others who would come for them, who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe.